first of all, just to get into the idea of today, I brought along a few tools hurriedly gathered from the cellar in our house, our terraced house in Walkley. A few bits and pieces. There's the trowel. Also we've got the screwdriver. Various bits and pieces that I gathered together this morning. Tools, useful things, tools. And you need quite a lot of tools for different jobs. Yeah, if you're going to put a picture on the wall, this probably isn't the one to use. It might be more a case of screwing in some raw plugs or whatever. But then, if you're going to prune the roses, then this really isn't going to do the job, is it? You want something a bit more like these. Different tools for different jobs, and I've noticed most tools seem to have a kind of a sharp edge somewhere or other. There's a sharp bit, the business end, for doing the job. Not in all tools, but quite a lot of them seem to go with a sharp edge to help you do the business. And in terms of studying the Bible, exegesis, you can think about this thing of digging in the text. And you might think of digging out treasures that are buried in the Bible text, or you might think in terms of gardening, of growing, turning the soil and making a good garden so you can create a really nourishing meal for the family, whatever you want to do with the metaphor. But thinking of exegesis in terms of tools, and I think the kind of sharp edges, the tools with sharp edges, for me are questions. What we need to find is good, sharp questions to bring to the Bible when we're preparing sermons, or if you're leading Bible study groups, or doing one-to-one Bible study with somebody, whatever that involves the Bible and helping other people make sense of the Bible and wrestle with it. Sharp-edged questions are the key tools that we need. And it helps to have quite a full toolbox, to have quite a number of different questions in your toolbox that you can bring to the Bible text to help you dig out the treasure. So that's the idea of what I'm doing today, and to give you a number of questions. And I think in the course of the evening you'll think some of this will be familiar. So you'll think, I know this already. I do this stuff already. So in that case, that's great. I'd say just carry on doing it. And it might be encouraging to know that someone else thinks you're on the right lines. There may be other bits tonight that it's something you used to know but you've kind of forgotten. So tonight might just remind you of one or two useful things to bring to the text of the Bible that you just kind of lost along the way. That happens to all of us. So reminders can be useful. And hopefully there might be something that's new, that you hadn't thought of, you hadn't seen it in that light. And working out how to kind of blend that also into your sermon preparation. So that's the idea of what I'm going to try and do with you. And I'll work through this kind of handout, and we'll do a worked example. So I've chosen a passage coming up in the lectionary soon, the next month or so, and work through that to show you how I would use this kind of toolkit. And then after that, the second half of the evening, I'll give you 3 more passages which are also coming up in the lectionary in the next month or so, and suggest we have 3 groups, one on each passage, have a play with these tools, these questions, bring them to the text, see if they work, and then we'll pull it, come back together. And I think I want to encourage you to learn to be selective. As I say, if you're pruning the roses, then you don't use the chisel. So you've got to have learn to be selective about how you use your tools. So I'm going to give you quite a lot of questions, and some of them will be very useful for one kind of passage, but not much use for another. So you've got to learn to be selective. For this passage, these kind of questions are really helpful to understand it. But for that kind of passage, then maybe I need some other tools, some other questions. So you get the general idea, the picture of what we're doing. Let me find a handout and see if we can send that round, and hopefully it will all make some more sense. sense. There we go. There's some for you. And some here. You want to pass those to the back there? Thanks. Everyone got sight of one of those? You've got some spares? That's fine. Well, actually, spares are a good point. If you can think of anybody else who might use this, let's leave the spares. Why don't we put the spares on the table behind you there? And if you think by the end of the evening of someone else who might use this, might be a fellow reader or, I don't know, anybody else who's involved with the Bible in your church or whatever, then take them and pass them on if they're useful. Well, yes. Yeah, clergy might well appreciate them as well. So here we are. There's the sort of introduction. We've done that bit already. Different tools, different questions for different texts. To be used flexibly. Learn to use your own judgment. So let me just go through this with you and get the general picture of how it works. I've got a sort of step-by-step approach here. First one is finding the text. Which passage are we going to study? Which passage are we going to preach on? Now that may well be chosen for you. If you use the lectionary, then it's chosen for you. Not all churches do, or sometimes you may have a season where you have a series and don't use the lectionary. That's permitted in the C of E. So you may want to choose a passage, or it may be already decided for you. Second thing is surveying the text. First impressions. Before you get into the detail, just read the Bible passage. What seems to be going on in this passage? What does it seem to be all about? Try and just stand back and get a kind of first impression. First impression may not be your last impression. You may change it later, but just get your first impression. What impact does this passage have on you? Do you know it already? Does it have some resonance, some memories? Just jot down the first impressions and maybe read it in 2 or 3 different translations. One of the privileges of being English-speaking people is that we have a lot of translations available. Sometimes I think too many, but they're there, and of course they're free to access online. If you haven't discovered Bible Gateway yet, then do. So first impressions of the passage. Okay? Just doing the main headings here, and then I'll work through it in more detail with a Bible passage. Context, the wider picture. Which biblical book are we in? We've got this passage. Which biblical book are we in? And what do I know about that book? About what it's about? Maybe who wrote it, what it was written for, who the audience were. You might want to use a study Bible or a Bible dictionary for this kind of thing to get a kind of introduction to the Bible. And where does it come within this particular book? What's the previous chapter about? What's the next chapter about? This whole the context thing. Form or genre, what kind of writing are we looking at here? Most obviously, is it prose or is it poetry? But also within that, there are other kinds of writing. So what kind of writing is this, and how does that particular kind of writing work? Because poetry doesn't do things in the same way that prose does. Poetry is very concise, just gives you a few words that you need to chew on, whereas prose may give you a whole great series of paragraphs that you can zip through with the flow of the story. Fifth one, structure and movement. How is this passage organised? Is there any progression from the beginning to the end? Is there any kind of structure to it that you can identify? Is there anything that drives it along? If it's a narrative that keeps you reading it, usually in narratives there's some kind of tension or conflict going on that keeps you reading because you want to see what happens at the end of it. What's number 6? Now, digging deeper. This is where you actually get into the details. What's the main points of each part of the passage? Under number 5, I actually asked you to break it down into sections, what you think are the sections. Of course, your English Bibles will give you paragraphs or may even suggest what sections are, but you don't have to go with those, but that can give you some clues, some pointers. But then within those sections, what's the main points of each of them? How's the writer making those points? How do the details in the passage actually support this main idea in each paragraph or each section, whatever it is? So here we get into all kinds of things, looking for key words, looking at characters, looking at the verbs. Verbs are always good things to look at. What's going on? Who's doing what? And to whom? And who's saying what? Questions. Anybody asking questions in this passage? Imagery, symbols, metaphors, any of that sort of stuff going on. Using your imagination, entering into the world of the text. What's going on? What are people thinking and feeling? What does it sort of feel like? What does it smell like to be in the middle of all this? And so on. There's a whole number of different things we can use with digging deeper, the more detailed analysis. Over the page, the big picture. Having done that sort of digging deeper stuff, which takes you into the sort of zooming in, the close-up, then standing back again. What is the main point of this passage? You may have thought about that earlier when you looked at structure, but now you want to rethink, was I right? Or do I want to change my mind? What's the main point, the main message going on here? Can you summarise the main idea in one sentence? What response do you think the author was looking for from the original hearers or readers? Then learning from others, secondary literature. What do commentators say about this passage? Now you may notice what number have I put this in my running order. What number is this? Number 8. It is not number 2, which of course is a temptation, especially when we're short of time. Read the passage and then quickly find a commentary who tells me what it means. That's very understandable. I mean, we all do that at times, but I want to encourage you to do the other steps first. In other words, to learn how to dig for the treasure yourself, and then look at the commentators and see what they say. And they may affirm what you've noticed, or they may point you in other directions. But I think learning to use your own skills and your own judgment is really important and helpful. Not least if you get to a point or a passage where you don't have a commentary available and you've been asked to speak on this passage. So read the commentaries, but at this stage, if you can find one or two, then read them now. And you may want to refine your view once you've read the commentary, but don't feel bullied by the commentary or overawed. You know, these people write books, they must be right. This is not true. There are lots of books out there, and some of them are much more useful than others. And of course, the web is another whole world. There's all kinds of stuff on the web, from the sublime to the ridiculous. So learning to use your judgment with that. Just because somebody's got it published in a book or on a website doesn't mean it's necessarily the right thing. So, you know, learn to use your own judgment is what I want to encourage you with. And then finally, so what? Very important. Key bit for preachers, applying the text today. What does this passage mean for me and for us, for our church today? What does it say about God and about God's claim on us today? Looking for various things that might help us with the application. Does it inspire, teach, threaten, promise? Does it lead us to think and feel differently? Does it lead us with unanswered questions? All kinds of things just to help us apply this. What kind of community does this passage urge its readers to become? Some of those kind of questions can be really good for application of the passage. So that's still all a bit theoretical. Let's just try and do it together with a passage, and then I'll set you loose in groups to have a play. I've chosen, there's a passage a couple of weeks' time from Exodus. I've chosen the Old Testament, partly because I love the Old Testament, and also I think it's neglected. How many of you in your churches hear the Old Testament read regularly? Give me a show of hands. Okay, fair number. Because in some churches they just slim it down to gospel +1, and the +1 is often the letter, the epistle, and the Old Testament just gets marginalised. So I'm glad to see a number of you do hear the Old Testament. And I think the Old Testament for me is like the operating system for the New Testament. If you think if you're on your computer, you're trying to open up a Word file or a PDF file, but you haven't first installed, say, Windows or whatever your operating system is, it won't work. It just comes out garbled. You've got to have the operating system there so you can then do the stuff like open the Word files and the PDFs and so on. And the Old Testament is really like the operating system for the New. It's the assumed basis of thinking and what's going on. And I think it's very hard to make sense of the New unless you've got the Old in some way in your mind. I mean, you can do it. A friend of mine at university, no church background at all, came along to a mission event we had, took away a copy of John's Gospel, went home, read the first 11 chapters in bed and fell asleep, woke up the next day, read the rest, and became a committed Christian, and still is today. And he just from reading John's Gospel. So you can actually just read the New Testament and God can kind of speak to you very powerfully. That's his experience. But even then, you very soon in John's Gospel start tripping over things about Jews and Gentiles, about temples, about Pharisees, about the Lamb of God. I mean, what's all that about? All kinds of stuff there, which is assuming the knowledge of the Old Testament. So even in John's Gospel, it is there as the background, the operating system. So I'm always keen to encourage the Old Testament. So I'm going to work through a bit of Exodus, which comes up a week on Sunday, Exodus 14. Kind of a change of voice. I wonder if, since you're readers, I'm hoping one or two of you might be able to read. Anyone like to read this passage for me? Any offers for a bit of? Okay, if I'll give you it here on the handout. Now I could even be clever and try and give you a microphone if I because then it'll show up on the thing we're recording, hopefully. If I put that there and you clip that to yourself.
Thank you.
Will that be all right? And then I'll retrieve the mic in a minute. Squeeze that one there. There we go.
All right.
Try that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Exodus 14, 19 to 31. The angel of God who was going before the Israelite army moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and took its place behind them. It came between the army of Egypt and the army of Israel. And so the cloud was there with the darkness, and it lit up the night. One did not come near the other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great work that the Lord did against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses.
Great, thank you. In fact, Kirsty, why don't we give out these messages now, because then you can see the one we're working on, and then you'll have the others for later. Should have thought of that earlier. Pass those around. Thank you very much. Check how we're doing for air and also for sound. I'm aware of the sound of the traffic, but I'm also aware if we shut the window it might get a bit warm, and I'm not quite sure. Do you know how to do the air conditioning in here?
I know how to do that.
Is that possible to
Shut the window.
pop that on? It's getting a bit muggy, but it's also might be a little bit noisy. Is that okay for people if we shut the window but get a bit of cool? Now, if it gets too chilly and drafty, which air conditioning can do, then just sort of signal to me and we'll improvise. I know I sometimes turn it on and then turn it off again for myself. Okay, so is that right? So there's the passage from Exodus. So let me just work through this to give you an example. I mean, this is not something I spent a huge amount of time on. I tried to be realistic, so I spent some time, but I haven't spent hours and hours on this because I know you haven't got time to spend hours and hours as well. So this is just my attempt to look at this passage, which is coming up soon, and use the toolkit. So let's have a go and see. Which passage? Finding the text. Well, it's been chosen for us. I'm assuming we're a church that's following the lectionary, and this one is there, and decided to preach on this. You don't have to preach on the Gospels. Many churches traditionally do, and there's very good reasons to preach on the Gospels, but you don't have to. So you're perfectly entitled to choose whatever passages are there for the week. Surveying the text, first impressions. Read it several times, fairly quickly, different translations. Don't get into details yet. The big picture. Have you heard this before? Any memories? Do you think you already know it? Memories of this one? Well, but I suppose some of us might remember Cecil B. DeMille and the Ten Commandments. Sort of comes to mind. This awesome epic extravaganza of however old. Those more recently might have done this one. You know, this one. This is Christian Bale doing Moses, Exodus, God and Kings. A rather strange and intriguing version of the passage. Actually, you can have a lot of fun in a sermon or a Bible study just playing a clip from something like this and seeing what this does with the Bible text, and then getting conversation between Hollywood's version and the Bible version, and what's similar and what's different, and why. You can actually do some very interesting things with that. So yeah, that's where we might have heard it before. And of course, cinema can influence our picture. You know, we may have Charlton Heston ingrained in our psyche from watching. He is Moses, you know, for some of us. So we have to be aware of that. You know, there may be more to Moses than just Charlton Heston or Christian Bale or whoever.
I watched that film last night, and the interesting thing was the angel of the Lord, this young boy.
Yes. One of the very strange things about the Christian Bale one is that God shows up as a small child who seems rather small and weak, and also rather stroppy at times, I felt. Not always very attractive, actually. Interesting. I still can't quite work out what I think of that, what they do with that there. But anyway, so that's something that's in me in terms of my experience of the book. First impression of the text. Do come in and find whatever you need. That's fine. There's a table here or a chair. First impression. What does it seem to be about? Well, my first impression is Moses and the people escaping from danger. That's just my first impression, so scribble that down. Over the page, number 3, context. Which book are we in? We're in Exodus. And again, if you're looking for the operating system of the New Testament, Exodus especially is very important. It crops up in all sorts of ways in the New Testament. So what do I know about this book? Well, Exodus, what does it mean? It means going out. Something about going out. They're coming out from Egypt. There's Moses in there. Moses is the kind of central figure in that book. I know that. Who wrote it? Did Moses write it? Well, you can get into various complicated arguments there. Did Moses write it? Most scholars agree now that the final form of these books seems to have been shaped later in the exile. But what kind of memories and traditions they drew on, how far back did they go? Some of them may have gone right back to Moses. You can get into all kinds of stuff here which is speculative and doesn't really help you produce a good sermon. So I wouldn't get tangled up with all the stuff about author and different theories of authorship and all that. I might just mention it in a sentence, but I wouldn't go there in a sermon because It won't sort of feed people. What else in this book? It's about the formation, the birth of God's people, Israel as a nation. That's kind of what the book of Exodus is doing. What else is in Exodus? After this we have the commandments. God gives the commandments. After this, that's important. Before God gives commandments, he saves them. That's really important. Grace comes first, and then comes the law. How do we live in this new relationship with God as a people? So there are these commandments about worship and living and so on. But that's later in the book. First of all, God does this saving thing, which they cannot do themselves. So that's stuff about the book of Exodus. Where are we in the book? Well, there's been a build-up, hasn't there, to this? And of course, you can't assume people know the story. That's an important issue nowadays. I sometimes hear people say, we all remember this, that and the other. You know, we all know that Jesus taught this parable, or we all know that Moses... Actually, we don't all know. Increasingly, people don't know. So when you're preaching, you may need to retell the story, which of course takes time, has to be concise. There's been this crisis with Pharaoh oppressing the people, and God through Moses saying, let my people go. A series of plagues. Finally, with the last epic plague, Pharaoh lets them go, and then he changes his mind and chases after them again. And so now they come up to the seashore, and Pharaoh's army is bearing down on them and going to wipe them out. That's the kind of story so far. God's protecting them. There's this angel in a sort of fiery cloud. It looks like a cloud in the day and like a fire at night. But even so, now we've come to the crunch point on the shores of the sea. And then the chapter after this, they sing a song of celebration once they've gone through the sea. So that's a bit on the context, the wider picture of this book of Exodus. Next, form or genre. What kind of writing is this? Is it prose or poetry? Well, that's an easy one. It's prose. The next chapter actually has poetry, a very old poem in Exodus 15, but most of Exodus is prose. What kind of prose? Is it historical narrative, prophecy, apocalyptic, wisdom, law, gospel, parable? This is historical narrative, isn't it? The way this is presented. A narrative, an account of the history of the people of Israel. So what do we know about historical narratives? How do they tick? How do they work? Well, they tell a story full of characters, interesting characters, blending together a rich mixture of suffering and hope, comforting us with hope and possibilities and vision, but challenging us as well with the hard stuff of life and sometimes holding up the mirror to us, to what we look like. And God works in the world, in and through people. That's part of the idea of these narratives, whether it's Old Testament narratives or gospel narratives. God is in there in the world, working through and in people in spite of their messiness and their failings and all of the rest of it. That's the stuff of narratives. Okay, structure and movement. How's this passage organised? Can we break it into sections? Well, you see what I've given you there, that's straight off Bible Gateway. It gives us 4 paragraphs. I ended up with 3 actually. I reckon 19 and 20. And then 21 to 29, the heart of the action. And then 30 and 31 kind of rounds it off. So I've gone for 3 paragraphs, not 4. You haven't got you'll find different Bibles break things up in different paragraphs because it's not there in the original Hebrew or Greek. So it's your kind of judgment call, really. So I'd say the first bit, 19 and 20, is the kind of build-up, the standoff. The 2 armies kind of separated in the dark, can't find each other, the calm before the storm. And then 21 to 29, we've got the drama, the action. The armies come together, and there can surely only be one winner. As this massive Egyptian superpower bears down on this kind of rabble of people on the seashore. And of course, there is one winner, but it's not the Egyptians. They are saved from certain destruction in this miraculous way. And then 30 and 31 kind of rounds it off, summary reflection. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day. Israel saw the great work of the Lord, and so on. So that's my 3 sections. Look out for repetition. of words, phrases, ideas. There's the word Lord, behind Lord, of course, is Yahweh, the name of God in the Old Testament. That comes up a lot. Israelites comes up a lot. The sea comes up a lot. So just noticing repeated things. How does it start and how does it finish? Sometimes the Bible passages start with something and then it comes up at the end again. You're almost back where you started in a kind of round, balanced way. This one does something very different. It starts here with crisis, disaster, destruction, and ends there with salvation, miraculous change, transformation. So we finish in a completely different place from where we started. Are there any chiastic structures, step structures, kind of mirror structures? This is more useful actually in poetry. So again, be discerning with these questions. I'd say this doesn't usually help us so much in prose, more in poetry. But the point of this is sometimes in a Bible passage, the key thing is in the middle. Especially in poems, the kind of high point, that the real thing is in the middle. And actually, here in some ways, there is a key moment in the middle. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites," verse 25. "For the Lord Yahweh is fighting for them against Egypt." And the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched out his hand and the sea returned. So actually there is a high point, a key moment in the middle, even here. Is there any surprising twist in the story or moment of climax in the action? This is one that's more useful in narratives, perhaps less useful in poetry. Is there a kind of twist, a crucial moment? And I'd say it's that kind of central moment there where the tables are turned through God's miraculous intervention. Moses stretching out his hand, it comes twice in this passage. Is there any crisis, tension, conflict? So that's often a great one to bring to a narrative. And if so, is it resolved? Or is it left unresolved at the end? And of course here the great tension is, are they going to be wiped out? Is this the end of the road? So that's what keeps you turning the pages to read and see what happens next. Is it resolved? Well, it's sort of resolved. They're saved, they cross the sea, the Egyptians are destroyed. But then we're in the desert. So what happens next? So keep turning the pages, see where the story goes next. So in a sense, it's not totally resolved yet. Is there a flow in the argument, progression in the story? Yeah, I think we've seen that. The action flows along, the barrier is overcome, and the sea is crossed. So on to digging deeper. Having done that sort of broad brush stuff, what about digging deeper? What's the main point in each part of the passage? How is it making that point? And what's the details that support the main points? So try and work out what the key words are. And this again is a kind of judgment call for you. What do you think are the key words here? Saved, I think in verse 30. The Lord saved Israel. I reckon that's a key word for me. But what does it mean, saved? Does it mean standing up at an evangelistic rally? It's a different kind of save to what we might immediately think. He saves them in a very physical, practical way from oppression, from slavery, in that kind of salvation. Yahweh is fighting for them, the Egyptians say. I think that's another kind of key word or phrase. Israel, the Israelites, that comes up a lot. It's this whole thing of this nation being formed. This is one of their formative experiences as a people. They're becoming a nation that God's leading. Look at the characters in the passage. Particularly useful in narratives, but also in poetry you may well find characters there. But what are they saying and doing, and what's being said and done to them? How do they relate to each other? Well, there's Moses acting as the Lord's agent, being obedient. So actually the Lord himself, Yahweh, is one of the characters. In fact, the key character in this drama. So if you're looking for characters, don't miss the big one. The Egyptians are there, the Israelites are there, Moses is there, Aaron's there, and so on. But the Lord Yahweh himself is a key character. That is an actor in this drama. It's Yahweh, the Lord, who's commanding and acting. The Israelites, key character, trusting, going forward in spite of the impossible danger of the situation. Look at the verbs. What kind of tenses? Past, present or future? It's mostly past here. We're looking back at what God did in the old days, in the birth of our nation, if you like. That's what's going on. The past tense is here a lot. Subject of the verbs tends to be the Lord, Yahweh. It's the Lord who's doing stuff. Moses is doing stuff too, and so are the Israelites, but ultimately it's Yahweh who's the subject of the key verbs, who's the active one here. Israel does things. Israel saw, they feared, they believed in the final verse. And you might compare that with the passage that came before this, which of course isn't given us in the lectionary, and you may want to allude to it. Just before this, the Israelites, in great fear, cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you've taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." I wish that bit was in the lectionary reading. It's marvellous, but of course it would make too long a passage. But you're the preacher, you can bring that bit in, because that's actually underlying this. Israel has gone from panic, despair, anger, to now actually trusting, moving forward, and seeing that God does this amazing thing. Look for any questions in the passage. Anybody asking questions and answering questions? In this one, no, can't find any questions, so that tool doesn't help us move on. Imagery, symbolism, metaphor. Again, tends to be more in poetry. Poets love metaphor. The righteous is like a tree planted by the river, flourishing, prospering, always fruitful. That's Psalm 1. Poets love metaphor. Less imagery, symbolism here, but there is this thing about the fiery cloud, something there about God's protection and power. There's also the sea. The sea in the Bible is often something to do with a fearful, dangerous realm, the forces of destruction that threaten to overwhelm us and are very powerful and menacing. The sea often has those connotations in the Bible. So there may be something there of symbolism in this crossing through the sea.
Well, because the sea forms it's interesting, it says it twice, doesn't it? It forms a wall for them. And that's interesting, isn't it? That it goes from being something that's terrifying to something that's utterly protective.
Yes, the sea forms a wall. Well, even then, the wall might be quite scary. If you're walking through it, there's still this sense of, is this wall going to collapse on me? So I still wonder what that felt like. This is another question here. Can you get into the feelings of the people in the passage? How do they feel, the Israelites? There must be bewilderment, excitement, exhilaration, but I would still feel a bit nervous about this wall of water around me. I don't know how you would be, but that would be part of my sense. It might be protective, but it might also still be potentially dangerous. So yes, imagination, enter into the world of a text. The Egyptians, how are they feeling? They're obeying orders, doing what armies do, but then they've never come across this kind of situation before, and they end up in a kind of blind panic. There's the final verses, something of wow, of awe and gratitude, looking back and seeing this salvation that God has done in this impossible situation. Irony, any of that? Irony, two levels of meaning in the text. What's irony? How do you think of Jesus on the cross, the message, King of the Jews. This is the King of the Jews. Two levels of meaning. At one level, that's the charge against the criminal. You put the charge against the criminal on the cross to show people why he's been executed. He said he was the King of the Jews. There's only one king, that's Caesar. But second level of meaning, the King of the Jews. This really is the King of the Jews. This man on the cross. He really is the king, especially in the way John's gospel portrays him. So John loves irony, two levels of meaning. Any irony here? I can't see much in this passage. So useful question for John's gospel, not so useful I think for this passage. I can't see much of irony in this one. Any sources being used? If you're in the New Testament, you might find a quotation from a psalm or a reference to Isaiah or something. Here in the Old Testament, it's maybe less of a useful question. So there's not much that's obvious there. So being selective with the questions that are useful for this passage. Stepping back then, the big picture. What's the main point of the passage? Having done all the detailed sort of digging. Well, I come up with this for my three sections. God protects his people by day and by night. That's the opening couple of verses, this thing about the cloud. And then the middle bit, God saves his people miraculously when they cannot save themselves. But they trust and obey him. So they have a part to play. They can't save themselves, but they trust and obey. And in the final two verses, the people respond to God's saving work in their lives. They notice it, they're amazed, they're grateful for it, and they make a response to it. Israel saw the great work that Yahweh did against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So that's my kind of points for each paragraph. And can we draw that together into one sentence that summarizes the whole thing? I think it's probably verses 30 and 31, really. The final verses, God saves his people miraculously, calling forth their trust in him. That's my kind of overall summary of the whole thing. Try to distill it down to one sentence is hard, but it really does help you in terms of a sermon. If you can get it to one sentence, then you can just preach around that key idea and make sure you get that across. What response do you think the author wanted from the original readers or hearers? Well, again, the last verses seem to give us some clues. Amazement, gratitude, trust, obedience. Learning from others. What do the commentators say? I picked up one commentary, had a look. It got me onto the symbolism thing. This thing about the sea maybe representing destruction and death, and Israel passing through it, the nation being born, and Egypt, which again is quite a symbolic name in the Bible, symbolizing human powers that are set against God's purposes, swallowed up and destroyed. That was something in the commentary. And a nice, just one quote from the commentary. At the very darkest moment, when all hope seems lost and following the path of God appears to have been hopeless folly, the power of God breaks through. I like that bit about hopeless folly. It seems like God and Moses don't know what they're doing, but then God shows up. It's the sort of like the foolishness of God in 1 Corinthians, which, how can the cross possibly, how can God be in all this? But the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. Lastly, so what? Applying today. Does it inspire, warn, teach? Does it make you feel happy, sad, guilty, angry, confused? Just a few things here. Inspiring. I think God's grace in saving Israel. There's something there that's inspiring. God's power. Something there that's awesome. There's God wiping out the Egyptians. Disturbing. Alarming. Judgment. Uncomfortable stuff. God's call to trust when in danger, as well as looking back afterwards. So the challenge of that, can you trust in the thick of the danger, not just afterwards when it's all worked out all right? Any unanswered questions? Well, the whole thing of judgment, how do we handle that? Did it really happen? Some people ask that. Did this really happen? Can we prove it really happened? Can we prove it didn't happen? Was it a natural phenomenon? Exceptional tide and exceptional wind? Some people have argued that way. Even then, the thing about miracles is really the timing. Whether or not it's a natural phenomenon, it's the fact that it happened at that moment is the miracle. So it's the timing that's miraculous. Whether you say it's a natural phenomenon combination of tides and wind, or whether it's just a wall of water like Cecil B. DeMille or whatever, it's the timing that actually makes it a miracle. Observe the effect this has on people in the church. Does God act today, not just in the past? That might be one question for people in our churches. How do we think and feel about judgment, this disturbing stuff of God wiping out the enemy? That might well be an issue for people in the churches as well as for us as preachers. Looking for any universal hopes or fears or values or beliefs. Anything about God's character, God's relationship with human beings, our relationship with each other. Well, there's something here about how God saves and people can't save themselves, about people needing to learn to trust, about God creating a people, creating a community. There's quite a lot there that's rich, that sort of resonates with us. Any contemporary issues that it might also connect with? Are they similar? Are they also different? Well, I suppose slavery, the Israelites were slaves, and slavery is still among us, and we're becoming more and more aware, even in this country, of slavery and the shocking degree of it. But it's not so obvious and in your face as it was in those days. It's more kind of subtle and hidden. God's call for justice. God wipes out the oppressor in this story. God's call for justice, but he may not wipe him out with a kind of Moses-led scenario and a miracle at the sea, but still this sense of God being a God of justice and wanting to liberate the oppressed and destroy oppression. What kind of community does this passage urge its readers to become? How can we embody that in our church? Something about trusting, about awe, about thankfulness. The next chapter, 15, is a great song of praise and worship. Community that acts together. Community that seeks justice. Might be a number of things there that could work in the so what aspect. So that's a whistle-stop tour through a passage, and I hope it gives you an idea of this toolkit and how to use it selectively. And that's crucial. That's why I keep repeating it. Just brief comments and feedback before I set you loose on some other passages. Responses, questions, comments?
I suppose it made me think about the flooding in Texas and in India, the whole thing about the sea. And I just thought that will probably be in the minds of, if we were preaching on this, that would be in the minds of the congregation as well. And
yes.
I suppose it might be worth thinking about how to deal with that. I mean, again, I suppose it does, it's a very potent picture of the power of the sea.
Yes, that's a good point. If there's something in the news that might resonate with the Bible passage, then being aware of that. So that's an interesting example, because of course there's floods in Texas and South Asia, as you say, but then you think, are they God's judgment like this is God's judgment on the Egyptians? And I think we would say no, this is something completely different. It might be a judgment in terms of climate change and how we're messing the world up, but so yes, I think if there's something in the current news that might make that connection, then having that in mind is quite important, I think. Yeah, thank you. Other comments, reactions, questions?
I think you have to be quite careful about this passage, because my heart goes out to poor Egyptians, which is really,
yes.
really not the response the writer wants to evoke in me.
Yes.
So, and the wives and children and all those poor charioteers caught in the mud. And so I think when you're talking about it to a congregation, you need to make it clear that this is not quite a fairy tale, but it's at that level of discourse, in the sense that there are baddies and goodies, and it's right that the baddies are killed, which is, almost a childish sort of way of looking at a story. But the story is not a sort of, is otherwise, I think you end up with that difficulty with the Old Testament that puts a lot of people off religion altogether. He says that God just zaps people, and he's really nasty to people, So I think you've got to, in a sense, make it clear that this is a symbolic, almost a symbolic narrative,
Yes.
as well as a possibly historical account.
There's a lot of symbolism. I mean, certainly
It's more a myth.
Egypt in the Old Testament becomes a kind of archetype for whatever is oppressive, and Pharaoh really is the bad guy in this story. And I think you can say, what about these guys who just have to obey orders and they get wiped out, and Pharaoh doesn't get wiped out, presumably. I mean, it depends. In some films he does, but presumably he's safe behind the lines. So that also raises questions of how despots give orders and who actually suffers as a result. The ordinary people in the army and the civilians and their relatives and all the rest. So I think there are some questions to raise. But I think you're right. The thing of symbolism here, Egypt and the forces of oppression that want to break God's people and enslave them, that whole symbolic thing that's going on is strong in this passage, and I think that's important. Yeah, one more. Yeah.
Do an analogy with North Korea, couldn't you, with the dictatorship of Kim Jong-un with Pharaoh, and with Pharaoh, sorry, and all his cohorts and his oppressed people kept on their relatives in the south. You could do a little twist on that.
Yes, I mean the elite always preserve their comforts.
Yes.
So the dictator and his close circle won't get affected by. If you have sanctions and things, the sanctions tend to hit the ordinary people who can't get food, whereas the elite find ways to protect themselves. So that's a real issue for us, I think. And
Mr. Trump's the angel of the Lord.
yes, that's an interesting question. I never thought of Trump as the angel of the Lord, but discuss. Yes.
It was interesting. You used the term oppression during your exegesis of it.
Yep.
And I think that one approach today might be that it's looking at destruction of oppression and the means of oppression, and that today, if we were looking at the section, the last section, how do we apply this today? I think that is probably a more accessible way of looking at it. The destruction of the means of oppression does not necessarily mean, wiping out thousands of people. There are other ways in which oppression can be resisted and can be fought against, like during the Charlottesville riots in the States. There's the footage of in fact it's interesting actually, there's some quite interesting video footage of clergy and lay people forming a line down the street. On one side of that line were armed militia, and on the other side of the line were people going about their business. And I think that is a way in which today I think we might look at that.
Yeah.
In terms of you are still dealing with oppression, and sometimes today who the oppressor isn't always as clear cut.
Yeah, and how God calls us to respond.
How we are called to
I mean,
respond.
this is one unique formative moment in the history of Israel in the Bible account. It doesn't happen repeatedly.
Yeah.
So God's not going to come and show up and do walls of water to wipe out all our oppressors. But there is still this sense that God wants his people to be in his image in terms of concern for justice, and therefore how do we respond to oppression if it's not going to be exactly like this? What is it going to be like? I think that's very important. How does it
Although
apply?
if it does want to do it in our house to get rid of the spiders, I don't mind.
All right. Okay.
The water fleetingly came to mind, although how you could link that to baptism. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, well, I think actually, I seem to remember the New Testament does talk about the Israelites going through the sea. Doesn't Paul link it with baptism? Is it 1 Corinthians 10 or something? So there is something there in terms of the symbolism of going through water to a new start, which the New Testament does occasionally touch on.
You'd have to be very careful at artisans, talking about the nitty-gritty of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think my sense with the Old Testament is don't be in a hurry to jump to the new. People often feel safer in the new, so they want to find something in the new. But I would say preach on an Old Testament passage on its own terms, like I've done now, and see what it says. And then there is resonance with the new. This whole thing of God saves miraculously, we can't do it ourselves, it's all grace. And then he gives us commandments to live by. I mean, there's so much there that is New Testament, but let's just see what's in the Old and how it presents that. And we're out of time. Let's turn to the passages. I've got 3 more, which all come up in the lectionary. So there's a bit more of Exodus, and there's Philippians 1, and there's Matthew 20. So we'll just read them all, and then you can choose which one you fancy within the limits of the geography. So we may need to shuffle around a bit. Sorry, Imogen, you have a...
I was just going to say, at this halfway point, you normally have a quick break.
Yep.
People to grab another cup of coffee if they want. There's
Yep.
some in the flask.
Well, let's read the passage, and then you can decide which passage you want, and come back to a different table if that suits you. Is that all right?
Yes.
Let's hear the passages, and then you can decide which one you want to go for. Is that okay? Anyone like to read Exodus 17? I won't play with the microphone for now. We'll just go with it. Can anyone offer me Exodus 17? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Far away with that one.
Yeah.